Introducing our speaker tonight is one of our trustees who you all know very well, has been a wonderful friend of the council, and served as the U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg in the early 70s, and then as the United States ambassador to the Netherlands. To introduce our speaker, it's my great pleasure to present to you Ambassador Kingdon Gould.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a strange kind of an introduction, and I'll explain to you why. Because, as you know, everything is connected with people, and I will explain my relationship to our speaker this evening, but I've first of all got to give you a little background. It was back in the mid-50s that a close business associate of mine and I learned that there was a wonderful piece of land in the Republic of Panama that was for sale. It was quite an extensive property, approximately 500,000 acres. And we were very excited about this possibility, and we journeyed down to Panama, and we chartered a boat, and we looked at this property from the Pacific, where it is located. It's on the Peninsula de Azuela, if you ever care to look at a map of Panama. The property was known as Mariato, and it had a wonderful seacoast, about 30 miles of seacoast. It had mountains that went up to 4,000 feet. It had no roads. It had no port. It was not accessible. And so we thought it was an exciting piece of property, and we arranged to do a little safari on it, and it was a wonderful piece of land. Eventually, my business associate and I acquired this piece of property. Now, this piece of property had belonged to the Holden family of Cleveland, who owned the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Trust Company, and to acquire the property we had to negotiate with the chairman of the board of the Cleveland Trust Company, and I remember doing so on a very cold day with the snow falling. We'd come up from Panama, and I had to put a blanket from Eastern Airlines around my shoulders because it was the last plane that got in. But we acquired the property. And then the next question was, how are you going to develop this property? And the thought occurred to me that the way to approach the property was with a landing craft. And at that time, there were surplus landing crafts, which you could buy for $1,250 from the U.S. government. And we bought such a landing craft, which is about 54 feet long. It has a front that drops down. And we went over here, and this is why I'm so darn long-winded, because we went right over here to Smith's Boat Yard in Baltimore Harbor. And we fitted that boat out with 2 new gray marine diesel engines and a little house that fit on top. This was long before global positioning existed. And when the vessel was ready, we loaded it up with a 4-wheel drive truck, Army surplus, a welder, some farm equipment, a variety of machinery, and so forth. And then I set out as the captain of this vessel, and I sailed her down the inland waterway, and I sailed her down to Key West. I had to do this on weekends because I'm also trying to earn a living as a lawyer, so I'd fly down and sail and then come back. Got as far as Key West, and sailed over to the place that I thought would be fine, which was Havana. I couldn't understand why the PBYs were kind of dive bombing us. Well, that was just before Castro took over. But for some mysterious reason, they didn't drop a bomb on us. A week later, I went down with my 10-year-old son and 2 friends, and we then coasted down to Panama by going from Havana to the Cozumel, to the Islas de la Bahia, and then around to Corn Island, and finally to Colon. It was a wonderful trip. The name of the boat was the Dos Gringos. The boat was called the Dos Gringos because on this piece of land, what we didn't realize was they were about 7,500 squatters living there. And they had their own access to a publication. And so we read about our having acquired this property with a little notice that said, Dos Gringos provocan rebelión de los campesinos. So when it was our time to sail down, we thought it would be great to try to turn it around a little bit, so we called the boat the Dos Gringos. Well, now, Panama's laws with regard to taxes was such that the land passed from our control. There is a little silver lining to the story, but that's for later. But what I really want to tell you was that helping us in the development of this property, and we did develop the coconut plantation, and we did develop edible oil program down there, that we were able to meet a wonderful group of young Panamanians. And while we lost the property, we gained the lifelong friendship of a wonderful group of young people, educated, highly intelligent, world-traveled people who make things happen. And from among these friends is our speaker this evening. Mr. Vallarino is a distinguished entrepreneur. He is the CEO and the president of the Coca-Cola Bottling Company of Panama. He founded a bank, actually two banks, one very after the other. I don't know why he needs two. Maybe he does business between the two of them. But anyway, known as the DISA Bank, and he's the chief executive officer and founder of that. He decided that there was inadequate supply of bottles in Panama, so he founded a glass company. And he is the chairman and chief executive officer of the glass company. He is also a rancher and a lover of the outdoors. He is a graduate of Culver Military Academy, and he is a graduate of Dartmouth College. And while in New Hampshire, where he still retains a home, he was fortunate enough to meet a very charming and beautiful young lady, and they married, and they've had 6 children and a wondrously happy marriage together. Now, what you really want to know is that Mr. Vallarino, you don't want to know that he's a 20 handicap golfer. You don't want to know he's also the president of the local country club down there. But what you do want to know is he is one of these people that makes governments happen. He was instrumental in the election of the present president of Panama, the first lady to be elected in Panama. And he has been a wise power behind government. I'm delighted to present to you my very good friend, J.J. Vallarino.
Frank, Mr. President, Kingdon, members of the Baltimore Council on International Affairs, I can't help the temptation to tell you a little more about Kingdon's story. Because the end of that story is that finally General Torrijos, when he became dictator of Panama, he took away their property. And then they got pretty mad and left. Besides that, Mary broke a finger and she never wanted to go to Panama again. But the end of the story is that one part of that property was clear, and they kept that part, but it was of all those acres he mentioned, this was the smallest part, about 2,000 acres. That'd be a lot of property here. And so one day they said, well, we want to get rid of that. and I am what you might call a land lover. I'm very attached to the land. That's why I still have a cattle ranch. So I told my partner, we built a company in Panama, where they are stockholders, to process the coconuts that they harvested. Eventually, people didn't eat or use coconut oil, so we turned that into other types of oil and eventually became a big company. We had connections to make detergents and margarine and all kinds of things, and finally we sold it. I was very happy the day we sold it. But Kingdom doesn't know that at the end of the road, I bought from them about 1,000 acres, which I still have, and are now a shrimp farm. We still have some coconuts, but not too many. We have a reforestation program, and we have a shrimp farm. So you can, from next time you tell the story, you can tell about the shrimp farm. Well, this is indeed a pleasure. I am very flattered to find so many people here. I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but I wonder how many of you have been to Panama? And probably, I suspected as much. And you probably know some parts of Panama that I don't, because that happens. People that come from other parts of the world are curious, like he was. The place that they went to, I didn't even know it existed. But the problem they had was that it was full of squatters. And when Gilberto Arias invited me to go and take a look at it, I said, not me. I don't want this problem. What I would like to tell you about is beginning at the time that I became a member of the board of directors that administered the canal. It was called at that time the Panama Canal Commission. And it was composed of 9 members, 5 Americans and 4 Panamanians. And I was one of the Panamanians. And this happened just a few weeks after what at that time was called Operation Just Cause, and later the historians changed the name and called it the invasion of Panama. But just a few weeks after that invasion, that my wife and I witnessed from the balcony of our house, we had a new president, Guillermo Endara, which was installed by the grace of God and the Operation Just Cause. He named me on the board of directors of the Panama Canal Commission. And we immediately began to do something that we felt was very important, which was get rid of all the differences that had existed between the Panamanians and the Americans during the time of the dictatorship, and begin a new relationship where the members of the board worked as a unit and not as 2 groups in confrontation. And it was a lot of fun doing that, and we were very successful because during that period, during that initial period, the decision was made unanimously by the board, Americans and Panamanians, to widen the Gaylord Cut, to widen the pass that crosses the Continental Divide from 50 feet, I think it was, to 65 or 70, which is now in process. It was a $200 million project, and it was to take over 10 years to do it. We couldn't afford to do it any faster. with the income that we received from our tolls, from the tolls that were paid by the ships going through the canal. At that time, the average ship that went through the canal paid an average of $30,000 to go through the canal. When you averaged out the big ones and the small ones, that's what it came out to. So that was passed, and we proceeded to work with a lot of harmony. As a matter of fact, one of the most important meetings took place either in this building or one near to it, where we had a board meeting. We had regularly one board meeting every year in a U.S. port, so that the members of the board could get acquainted with what was going on in the shipping industry and what the ports were doing. We then proceeded to have an election in Panama, and the government changed, and I was no longer on the board of directors of the Panama Canal Commission. But we had already established a precedent where this board acted independently of the government. As you all know, the Panama Canal up until 1977 was operated by the Corps of Engineers of the United States Army. And the chairman of the board was supposed to be the president of the United States, who delegated on the Secretary of the Armed Forces, of the Department of the Army, who delegated on the Secretary of the Army, who delegated on the head of the Corps of Civil Engineers. When we came in, the head of the Army Corps of Engineers was the chairman of the board. When the government changed, the person named was the Undersecretary of the Army. And that was a very important change, which I'm later going to refer to again. But I want to go back to how things began to work in the canal with a great harmony, great understanding, and I'm happy to say that the following government continued the same policies that had been established by Endara, and this government is also following the same policies that were established by Endara. During that period, President Endara also named me to chair a commission to advise the government what Panama should do when it received the canal. The treaties were already signed, and nothing had been done. And I'm doing a little guesswork in what I'm going to say, but it is my opinion that the military had planned to do nothing except as one U.S. soldier left, they would put one Panamanian soldier in the same place. So at the end of the road, 10,000 U.S. soldiers would go home, and 10,000 Panamanian soldiers would take over the canal zone and all the facilities. So they had made no real plans to develop this area as we are now doing. And this change came about because this committee developed what we call a master plan, which we were able to do because we worked very closely with the United States Armed Forces that were carefully planning the process of moving out of the canal zone and the canal in Panama. And I have to give credit to General George Jalwin, who was the commander-in-chief of the Southern Command, a 4-star general, one of the 10 top generals at the time, later went as commander in NATO, of how we worked together our team and his team, to develop a master plan for the use of the areas, for the retirement of the U.S. troops, and the coming in of the Panamanian civilian population, the investors, the entrepreneurs from all over the world. And I'm happy to say that today there are all kinds of facilities in the hands of very important United States companies. Some of them, very few of them, the small ones are joint ventures. The very large ones, like Stevedores of America, they developed a port that has been a model for 3 or 4 others that have been developed as container ports. So we made this master plan, we made a transition program, and when the new government took over, they followed everything to keep the faith that our commitment was to keep the canal out of politics. And a former president of Panama, Nicolás Barletta, was named to head the group that was in charge of promoting and selling all the properties that were turned over by the United States in the canal zone to create industry, to create jobs, and the amount and number of things, the quality of the activities that have developed there are quite amazing. Today, we have privatized ports, we have a privatized railroad, we are privatizing the airport, and all this is the product of a new expectation that has come from this very important process of having Panamanians come into the area to take part in the development of all the canal zone, the former canal zone. The canal itself did the following. Under the chairmanship of Undersecretary of the Army Joe Reeder, it was decided that an independent appraisal should be made of the conditions or the condition of the canal, because in the treaty it stipulated that the canal had to be turned over in good operating condition. And there was a question whether the canal was really in good operating condition. So Joe Reeder proposed, and the board approved it, to call on the Army Corps of Engineers to name a special group of experts to go to Panama, take a look at the whole operation, and give a report on their findings as to what was the real condition of the canal. The Panamanian said, well, that's great, Joe, but let's have a Panamanian team to work with them. So they named a 5-man team, mostly engineers, some businessmen. They called it the Blue Ribbon Commission. And this Blue Ribbon Commission found that there was a lot of work to be done in the canal to fit that label of good operating condition. So the result was that the young man who chaired that Blue Ribbon Commission, Alberto Alemán, is now the administrator of the canal. He's the chief executive officer of the Panama Canal. And very capable young man, engineer, graduated in some university in the States. I can't remember which one. It wasn't Dartmouth College. But he is very capable. He proved himself, and that's why he has the job. But aside from that, the board of directors at that time decided that the budget that we had approved of $200 million was not large enough, and that waiting 10 years to have the cut widened was too long. So they voted a budget of $1 billion to bring that the end of that widening to the year 2002, and to repair all the other things that increase the number of tugboats, get bigger tugboats, improve the railings of the mules that pull the ships across, a general improvement and modernization program that is now underway. And we have been able now, in 6 months, that Panama has taken 100% of the operation of the canal over, to continue this program without any interference from any political parties or any of us politicians. It is now, as I said, 6 months, a little less than 6 months since we took over, since this new management took over. And if you come to Panama today, you will see container ports, 3 or 4 new container ports. You will see projects in Amador that are very promising. Programs in Cristobal for the new passenger cruise ships that are planning to stop there. And it's a very promising situation, and I hope that we have no reason to change course. I don't want to try and cover everything I can think of, because I hope I motivated you enough so that you'll have a lot of questions to ask. But I do want to emphasize my pleasure at being here with you, my thanks to the chairman and to Kingdom, and to all of you for your attention. And that's all, folks.
We thank you very much for your presentation. If you would, please.
If they don't want to ask any questions?
They're going to ask questions, yes, until 10 minutes after 7. The question was, are you still planning to add universities to the former canal zone?
Somebody came up with a bright idea of creating, where you had the Panama Canal College, a university for the, what they call it, wanted to call it the University of the Americas. And when they started playing around with that idea and taking it, we hired the New England Association of Colleges, something like that, to be a consultant. They, after several months of brainstorming, they came up with the idea that that was not enough. And they created something that they called the City of Knowledge. And this City of Knowledge is an amazing achievement that is now going on. It includes the old Canal Zone College as a university for all of the Americas. But we've taken about 1/3 of Fort Clayton and leased that to what they call now leading edge technology companies. And I cannot remember the names of them now, but we have about 16 companies already established in the City of Knowledge. And it is a beautiful project, and it is working. It's a bipartisan thing. It's non-political, totally. So I think it's another very, very sound and good idea that is getting a lot of support. We have received something like $400 million from Europe to develop a technological park within the City of Knowledge.
The question is, would you please comment on what some people see as the political complexities of the origin of the canal in Panama?
Well, actually, I had decided not to talk about that. It's a fascinating story. I'm just preparing for this meeting with you. I had been rereading some of that chapter, and it is fascinating. But it's all in writing. It's all in many, many books by many different authors, and they all have a different idea of what really took place. To summarize, what took place was that the decision had almost been made to build a canal in Nicaragua. And for some reason, Teddy Roosevelt and a couple of other members of his cabinet and advisors decided that that was not the place. That Panama was the best place to build the canal. So Mr. Bruno Varilla and a lawyer by the name of Cromwell, who was the lawyer for the French company, they got together and they did a hell of a job to get Roosevelt to do what he did. Now, to the Panamanians, it has always been a, let's exaggerate and call it a thorn in the flesh, but that's a good way to put it, that this treaty was signed by a Frenchman and not by a Panamanian, and that just the day before he signed, he was asked not to sign. Because there were some things in the Colombian treaty regarding payments and time and the size of the zone which were increased. But I venture to say that now with the 1977 canal treaties, that is in the history books. Nobody is much concerned with it. I think it's been wiped out of the conscience of the nationalistic memory of Panama. But you can read about it, and it's fascinating.
The question is, are there any special incentives for foreign investment in the dealing with the canal and the exit of the American military?
Jay, I don't think there are any new incentives, but they're the same ones that have always been in place, which I think are very large. A lot of the work that had to be done, I think, has been at least started, and some of it is already almost completed. We are now in the very interesting process of deciding what to do with Howard Air Force Base. And we have, luckily, we only have U.S. companies interested, so we don't have to worry about the Chinese. But there are 4 very, very important large groups that have come to Panama, have visited. We as members of the advisory committee have talked to them. And right now, we're in the process of coming to an agreement with them regarding the terms of reference for the bidding. It's a large area. The vision that a company such as one headed by the son of the gentleman who was a candidate for by Ross Perot Jr., the vision that they have presented of what they can do there is quite amazing, very interesting. It's a huge area. It's probably the biggest and most valuable piece of property that has been turned over. It was just turned over in November, and then we had the change in government, and then we had the change in the administrator of the reverted areas. And in our last meeting that we had with him, we approved a trip for him to go to Subic Bay in the Philippines. They recommended a person whose name I think is Gordon, who's supposed to have done a terrific job for the Filipinos in turning that into a very, very valuable asset, commercial asset to the country. So Mr. Arias has gone to the Philippines with a couple more people from the government to take a look at that and see what they've done and use this man as a consultant. This man now has a firm. When he worked in Subic Bay, he worked alone. Now he's got a firm, and we're retaining them to help us in making the best decision. And I think all the benefits, all the stimulus for doing this are in place. I don't think any change has been made, either to improve them or to take them away.
With respect to Mr. Eigel's earlier historical question, Ambassador Gould reminds me that there's a display at the Smithsonian Library entitled "Making the Dirt Fly" on the history of the Panama Canal and its construction. The question is, what is the impact upon Panamanians, work impact, especially with respect to the higher paying and more technical jobs at the canal?
I think there are basically three important impacts. The first one is that actually, even in 1977, when the treaties were signed, about more than 80% of the employees of the canal were Panamanians. By the time that Mr. Aleman became administrator, it was about 90%. And the figure that he gave me last week when I asked him what was the percentage at that time, he said it was 99%. So these people are trained. He told me that they spend an average of $10 million a year training, keeping the people up to date. They have to retire a number of people every year. A number of people quit, so they have to bring in new people. These people are very carefully scrutinized, and then they're put in training. And they have a school in the canal to train them. Besides that, by some magic that I haven't really fully understood, 5 years ago, we had 2 universities in Panama, maybe 6, 7 years ago. Today, we have about 15 private universities that have just come up, established themselves, put up buildings. Now they're putting up new buildings because they don't have any space. My wife's chauffeur attends one of those universities to improve himself and maybe apply for a job in the canal. So that has worked very well. The bad side, or as you say now, you want to hear the good side or the bad side, I forget how they say that. But the bad side is that we did lose a lot of jobs. We not only lost a lot of jobs, and this was all carefully analyzed in the master plan, what was going to happen. In the 10 years, the last 10 years, from 1990 to 2000, we were going to lose $400 million in the economy that were in purchases or rents or direct salaries paid by the couples who lived in Panama to the employees. $400 million. And besides, about 5,000 jobs. The process of developing the Panama Canal zone for civilian use, for industry and commerce and servicing ships, repairing ships, dry docks, in the industries where you bring in a produce and develop it and then ship it out again, has made a difference. And our rate of unemployment has gone down. Not a lot, but at least 2%. So we've had good news and bad news. We expected the bad news. The good news has been better than what we expected.
Would you comment upon the environment and the canal?
I'd be very glad to. We have recently, Panama, the canal, has recently signed an agreement with a Dutch company to reforest 20,000 acres of the canal watershed. We are paying very, very careful attention. The whole country is now very well aware of the value of that watershed, because we had a bad dry season a couple of years ago, and we had to diminish the load that the ships could go through, and that load is our livelihood. I said before that at the time I entered in the commission, the average price for a ship, the average toll was something like $30,000. Now it's over $100,000, because the shipping industry has developed a ship specially to go through the canal. They call it Panamax. And that ship pays upwards of $130,000 to go through. And they carry enormous amounts of containers. And that is also forcing us to do what I'm going to tell you in a minute. So the whole country is now conservation conscious, and particularly in the watershed. And also because we need more water. If we're going to widen the canal and eventually build a third set of locks so that the post-Panama ships can come through, we have to create a new set of locks that will accept those post-Panama ships. This has required that a special commission that has been working for about 2 years has found 2 other rivers beside the Chagres on the west of the canal that are where they're going to build 2 lakes. One at 800 feet that goes into another lake of 400 feet above sea level. Each one of those lakes will have a hydroelectric power plant and will furnish the canal with the water that it will need to get these post-Panama ships across the canal. This is a mighty project. I have already seen the designs. This will require moving people. It will require more reforestation, and it will make it possible for Panama to maintain the prestige that it's had so far by having the canal there, because it's going to make it workable. So what I had written in the speech that I didn't read is that this is all in the program of what we have to do, the challenge that we're facing, and the opportunities that we have.
Would you comment upon political stability in Panama?
One of the things that during my time in the canal and in that commission that I was appointed by President Endara to create a constitutional amendment. So the rules of governing the canal are in our Constitution. During that time, I had the privilege of working with three of your generals, General Jolwin, General McCaffrey, and General Clark. They are a different breed of military. The military in Latin America still have not really learned that they are to work for the civilian government and not for themselves. So what we did was we got rid of the army. After the Operation Just Cause invasion, we said no more army. And we put it in the Constitution. Panama will not have an army. Costa Rica did that 30 years ago, and they've done very well by doing that. So we have no army, but we have to have a police force. And the transition, because our army was army, police, navy, you name it. So now we have a police force that the United States is helping us to train. And we're having a lot of growing pains. And we have a lot of problems with the Colombians in the Darien border. And we have problems with traffic of narcotics. But we don't have any problem with overthrowing governments. We don't have any problems with stabilizing and our democratic system, which is now, I think, what every president is mostly committed to do is to maintain the democratic system. So we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of adjustments to make. Every government is different. The previous government lost the election because they didn't worry about the poor. This government is getting into trouble because they're worrying too much about the poor and not enough about the business community. So, but I think democracy is, thank God, and there to stay.
Would you comment further on the circumstances with Colombia and the difficulty of policing the border and the impact on narcotics?
It's like a former chairman of the World Bank used to say, you always have trade-offs. You can't have it both ways. We're training a very, very special police force to take care of the border. We're getting a lot of help from Colombia and from the United States. We're getting a fleet of helicopters to cover the area. Some people think it's a big problem. Some people think that it's a problem that we've always had and that it's just a matter of time before it disappears again. My opinion is that it's something that we have to be careful with, watch it closely, and I think the government is doing that. The communities are helping. And I'm not going to say that I don't worry about it. I do worry about it, but not to a degree where I lose any sleep over it. I just think about it in the morning.
There are two questions and a mystery observation. But the first question is, would you comment further on the environment, and especially the Smithsonian's operation there? And then secondly, on the circumstance of having many banks in Panama, a suggestion perhaps too many, and do those two things have to do with what Professor Zagafi-Najad describes as your neighborhood?
Well, I'm going to try and see if I can tie those two questions with the operation of the canal in some way. we're extremely lucky to have Smithsonian in Panama. They are a big operation, and they help the country in many, many ways. And in conservation programs, they couldn't do better. And they have this island in the canal named Barro Colorado, where they have all these different species, where they bring scientists from all over the world to spend a week or 10 days there looking around to see all the different kinds of wildlife that exist in this little island in the middle of the canal. As a matter of fact, the head of the Smithsonian in Panama, Ira Rubinoff, who is married to a good friend of my daughter's, just went to Europe to look at an idea that has been developed in Panama called Trade, Conservation, and Investigation, or Tourism, Conservation, and Investigation, TCI, based on the suggestion of having architect Frank Gehry, who built a museum in Bilbao, to design and build a museum in Panama that will take in all the different kinds of flora and fauna that exist in the country and make it a showpiece for tourism, for conservation, and for investigation. So it's great to have them there, absolutely. And they do more, and every year they do more. They get bigger. Regarding banks, of course, that conservation is vital to the canal because the canal lives on water. It's a water canal, and we use 50,000 gallons to get every ship through. Regarding the banks, well, we are for following the path of the world with mergers, acquisitions, so some friendly, some unfriendly, and that is taking place right now. As I talk to you, there's a big merger going on between two important banks, two Panamanian banks. 2 months ago, there was a big merger between two American banks. And so we had 140 banks at one time. And competition is very strong, and we are a small country, but we are a busy country. Like somebody said of Dartmouth College, it's a small country, a small college, but it's my own. Daniel Webster is said to have said it in a trial. I don't know whether that is what you wanted to know. You said something at the end that I couldn't quite work into the canal.
I guess the implication was that perhaps drug traffics and money laundering, to be very explicit, has something to do with the large number of banks.
You know, in that business of money laundering and drug trafficking, we've sort of been the fall guy. This saying in Spanish that the rope breaks at its weakest point. We have done everything we can possibly do to stop money laundering. And I think we've gotten rid of whatever there used to be there. I don't know whether you can completely stop that because there are so many ways to do it, and this is a city where you have people traveling in and out constantly. But I think if there is any going on, it's very small and far between. The drug trafficking is another problem. It has taken a turn because Panama used to be criticized as a country where drugs were taken through Panama. They didn't stay in Panama. Now we have a problem with our youth. So it's increased, and we are working very hard in reaching agreements with the U.S. to do jointly and inviting other countries to join to see what we can do to stop that, to protect our youth as well as yours.
Would you comment further on the environment and the watershed, especially in light of the development, industrial development in the zone?
You sound as if you've been in Panama recently.
Yeah, I work with Strive.
Good. Well, then you know what ANAM has been accused of. ANAM has been accused of doing too much and holding up development, and you know that fight has been going on for a long time. But when are you protecting the environment and the animals and the flies, butterflies, I mean? And when are you holding up progress? And right now they're in a tight spot because they have stopped a lot of projects because they did not meet the requirements. And the last time that he attended, the director, Ricardo Anguissola, attended a meeting of the cabinet, he was very, very badly accused of being too hard. So I interpret that as saying that he's been trying to do his best. And as a matter of fact, I have been at meetings with him and the president when she has told him, don't let that bay get used for certain purposes, and don't let such and such do this other thing because it hurts the environment. I think we're doing a good job, and I think we're going to do a better one. I'm personally gotten myself very involved in improving the environment, increasing reforestation projects, and working on this TCI project. So I don't feel pessimistic about that equation in the picture.
Well, we wish very much that we had more time to pursue this. This is the authoritative voice on these matters, and we're absolutely delighted that you've joined us. Your answers to the questions have been wonderful. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you so much.